So after you finish your quiz, this is your assignment for the rest of the class. I want you to have the notes handout that I prepared for you and fill in as you go through the video. When I ask you to stop and attempt a problem, then please do that. This is how you're going to practice this material. It is new material. It's blending in CPCTC with our triangle congruence, and I want to make sure that you're feeling okay with it. So write down any questions you have, make sure you do that, and you're going to complete the homework questions and upload to Schoology by taking a photo of the worksheet. Okay, so here we are. 4.3, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So that abbreviation we looked at last week was CPCTC. Make sure you know what that means. It's important to know what that means. So we've been trying to prove triangles congruent. We've been proving triangles congruent through side, 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 angle, side, angle, right hypotenuse leg, and angle, angle, side. But thinking back to the first lesson of the unit, we had congruence. So if these two triangles are congruent, so if I just draw them here, ABC and XYZ, I'm telling you right now that they are congruent. So you should know that all the sides are congruent and all of their angles are congruent. So if AB is congruent to XY, yes, that's true. And the reason why we know that is through CPCTC. The corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So it's important for you to understand what CPCTC means, but you need to know that the two triangles are congruent in order to use CPCTC as a reason. So if we know two triangles are congruent from the get-go, then we can prove their corresponding parts are also congruent. So the corresponding parts are the corresponding angles and sides. So let's see what happens here when we look at this in a proof. Okay, so we have PR bisects QPS. So QPS is there. So PR is bisecting this angle. That means this angle is being broken up into two congruent parts. Okay, so we can prove those two to be congruent, those two angles I just marked. And then also PQ and PS are congruent. So we can mark that. But the goal of the problem is to prove that angle Q is congruent to angle S. We can't say that angle Q and angle S are congruent yet. But the goal of the problem is to prove that triangle PRQ is congruent to triangle PSR, PRQ, PRS, sorry. So that we can say that Q and S are the corresponding parts of congruent triangles. So let's start this proof. Let's write down our given. Let's see how this will look. So we have PR, this segment bisects angle QPS. And we know PQ is congruent to PS. Okay, so that's our given. But from our given, we see we have these angles in here that are being broken up, the big angles being broken up. So we know that angle QPR is congruent to angle SPR. The reason why is because PR bisects the angle, so it's a definition of an angle bisector. Okay. Another thing that we can conclude from the diagram is what? What else do we know? So take a minute to think about it. What else do we know about the diagram? And again, our goal is to prove that these triangles are congruent first before we get to our actual proof statement. But if we're thinking about it, we know that, ooh, PR is congruent to PR through the reflexive property. Okay. Is there enough information for us to now conclude that triangles are congruent? So we have congruent sides, check. Congruent angles, check. Congruent sides, check. So side, angle, side. We can actually now state that triangle PRQ is congruent to triangle PRS through side, angle, side. So that wasn't what our proof wanted us to actually find. So roundabout way, this problem is telling you to prove the triangles are congruent to then help you get to your proof statement, angle Q congruent to angle S. But now that we know that these triangles are indeed congruent through the side, angle, side postulate, we can now say angle Q is congruent to angle S. Q through CPCTC. So after you prove triangles are congruent, then you can use CPCTC as a reason, because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So these proofs are a little bit more labor intensive in that you don't know which triangles that you have to prove congruent. So as we're looking at these problems, I want you to identify the triangles that contain the segment or angles you are trying to prove congruent. So in the previous example, angle Q and angle S was what we were trying to prove congruent. So in looking at this, we knew that PRQ and that PSR were the triangles that we needed to prove congruent first, and then we could prove that Q and S were congruent. So we want to do that first, and then we have to prove that those two triangles are congruent. So back to side, angle, side, angle, side, side, side. Those postulates, we're trying to prove triangles congruent. And then we're going to use CPCTC to prove the corresponding parts are congruent. So you must prove two triangles are congruent before using CPCTC. Okay, so on your homework a few nights ago, I looked at your uploads on Schoology. Many of you were using CPCTC as a reason for a lot of the questions on the homework, and I don't know why. So we did not discuss when CPCTC needs to be used as a reason in a proof, and now this is when we're going to have to use it. So make sure that you're clearing up the work that you did a few days ago, because a lot of the parts that we had angle bisector, definition of angle bisector, definition of segment bisector, definition of a midpoint, and it didn't have CPCTC. So go back and look at those to make sure that you're okay with it. Okay, so let's look at the second proof. So we know that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. Okay. So let's mark that on our diagram first, so then we can get a better picture of what we're looking at. Angle 1 and angle 2, angle 3, I'm trying my best, angle 4. Okay. And we want to prove that JL and KL are congruent. So I want everyone to think about what triangle you're trying to prove congruent. So take a minute to think about that. Pause the video, and then you can come back to it. I want you to try this on your own. So the two triangles we're trying to prove congruent are JML and KML. Okay, so that's what we're trying to prove congruent, because these parts, this JL and KL, are part of these two triangles. So we need to prove those triangles are congruent. Now, we also have LM is congruent to LM. That's how we can prove these triangles congruent, knowing they have a shared side. Here's the reflexive property. So triangle JML is congruent to triangle KML through what? postulate. Angle, side, angle. And now that we know that triangles are congruent, ding, 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 now we can prove that JL is congruent to KL. And the reason for that, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Again, we had to prove the triangles were congruent before we can use this as a reason. Okay. Let's look at this one. Let's write the given. I'm going to let you try this one on your own. But we have angle W congruent to angle Y. And then we have WZ is congruent to YZ. And then we have XZ bisects angle WZY. So that's all given here. All right, so let's mark up the diagram. We have angle W and angle Y. We have WZ and YZ. Those are congruent. And then we have XZ bisects this angle, okay, WZY. So if we know that it bisects that angle, think about what you know about the angles now. And I want you to try and prove WX is congruent to WX congruent to YX. So those pieces are over here. We want to prove these pieces are congruent. But we only know stuff about this angle, this side, and this angle. So pause the video, think about what triangles you're trying to prove congruent, then see how you can find your proof statement. Go. So from your given, we know that angle WZY is congruent to angle YZX. Sorry, WZX is congruent to YZX. So we have this angle here. Okay. And if you said we wanted to prove triangle WZY congruent to triangle YZX, I keep doing that. Sorry, WZX congruent to YZX, then you are correct. And we can prove that these triangles are congruent. Oops, I didn't write step 2. So we could prove these are congruent through angle, side, angle. So let's think about what goes here in step 2. So if we're using this information that something's being bisected, think about what is being bisected. It's an angle that's being bisected. So the definition of angle bisector. Now can we get to our proof statement after we've proven that these triangles are congruent? Yes. So we know these triangles are congruent, so the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent is our reason. Okay. So these proofs are a little bit more intense because it tricks you. It doesn't tell you to prove triangles congruent. You have to find the triangles that are congruent. So that's the only, the tricky part about it. So make sure that you're organizing your proofs neatly and make sure you are bringing all of your info to class and your computer to class each day. Thank you. Thank you.